We're talking about maps that were drawn roughly between the 1300s and the 1700s. In other words, in relatively recent history. However, these maps were largely based on much older source maps.
What if history as we know it is incomplete, edited, silenced, or even deliberately hidden? Graham Hancock has long claimed that forbidden evidence exists. Ancient maps showing ice-free Antarctica, drowned cities along vanished coastlines, and DNA trails that defy the textbooks. Could it be that humanity's greatest age of exploration didn't happen 3,000 years ago, but more than 12,000 years ago? And if so, who made those maps? Humans, or something else? In this video, we'll uncover Hancock's most controversial claims, the evidence mainstream science avoids, and why these maps could rewrite human history. The Forbidden Seafaring Age. When archaeologists tell the story of humanity's first great sailors, they usually point to the Polynesians. Around 3,000 years ago, men and women from scattered islands in the Pacific launched double-hulled canoes into the open sea and found islands thousands of miles apart. They carried families, animals, and crops. They read stars, ocean swells, bird patterns, and subtle changes in the wind.
Ancient Polynesians used the sun, moon, stars, planets, ocean currents, and clouds as guides that allowed them to see the ocean as a series of pathways.
They made landfall on specks of land invisible to the naked eye from the horizon. They even settled Easter Island, nearly 2,000 miles from South America and 2,000 miles from the nearest inhabited island. Modern scholars hold this up as the first time human beings dared to sail so far beyond the sight of land. And it's true, Polynesian navigation was extraordinary. But was it truly the beginning? Graham Hancock argues that this narrative leaves out an entire chapter of human history. What if the Polynesians were not the first? What if they were heirs to a much older seafaring tradition, one that began not 3,000 years ago, but 12,000 years ago during the last ice age? This is where Hancock takes the story in a direction most mainstream historians refuse to follow. Because if he's right, it would mean our ancestors had mastered oceanic exploration thousands of years earlier than we've been taught. The world during the Ice Age was unrecognizable by modern standards. Most of the water on Earth was trapped in gigantic ice sheets that caused sea levels to be depressed by perhaps 400 feet. This simple statement is a tragic one for human history. The areas in which early civilizations could have flourished are no longer visible. Entire coastlines that were once fertile and habitable lay beneath the sea. Any ports, harbors, or even cities along those ancient shores would have been swallowed up by the oceans as they filled rapidly following the end of the Ice Age, around 12,800 years ago. In Hancock's view, not a theory, but the missing piece that explains why the archaeological record seems so empty. Mainstream archaeology believes that there is no evidence found in support of an Ice Age civilization. Hancock responds, "Of course we don't. You're looking in the wrong place. If the most advanced communities were coastal, they would have vanished under floods of melting ice, and the only remnants would be fragments brought inland by myth, memory, or scattered artifacts. If there is silence in archaeological records, it is not indicative of absence. It is the price paid for not having archaeological evidence at present-day seas. This transforms our understanding of navigation. Picture Ice Age sailors, not with satellites or compasses, but with the same bare intelligence and determination of Polynesians. If they could build extensive seagoing ships to reach the land of Punt, crossing thousands of miles, 4,500 years ago, what does it matter to think that no one ventured out before them? Human beings have always been explorers. Why would the Ice Age be the one exception? Hancock argues that it is an error to underestimate our ancestors. given that ancient people wouldn't have been expected to travel across oceans, rests more on an idea stemming from arrogance than on the basis of evidence. If the Polynesians made it to Easter Island, what would keep an Ice Age civilization from crossing the Atlantic or the Pacific? The tools may have differed, but the same skills, courage, and need were still there. Polynesian history, as accepted by mainstream academics, commences around 1000 BC. Graham Hancock places it much farther back than that, into an unknown age that has been erased.
The great seafaring adventure that is accepted by archaeology is called the Polynesian expansion, and it's a remarkable story, and that occurs roughly 3,000 to 3,500 years ago.
An age when humans could have been sailing already, building ports on the coastlines of which we shall never find again, and disseminating knowledge across the continents. If that possibility is true, then the question becomes, what traces of their journey still remain today? The DNA that shouldn't exist. When mainstream archaeology insists that long-distance sea travel only began a few thousand years ago, one piece of evidence refuses to cooperate: DNA. For decades, geneticists have been tracing the origins and movements of human populations by studying unique genetic markers. These markers tell us where groups of people came from, where they traveled, and how they mixed with others. In most cases, the patterns line up with what we expect from migration models. But every now and then, something strange appears, something that doesn't fit the official timeline. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, geneticists have discovered a DNA signature that should not be there. Indigenous tribes, far removed from any ocean, carry genetic links not to nearby populations, but to people thousands of miles away, in Australia and the Pacific. This isn't a one-off finding. Multiple studies across the last decade have confirmed it. These markers are not flukes or contamination. They are consistent signals pointing to a connection that defies our current understanding of human migration. It is the obvious question: how? According to conventional thinking, there is no landway to justify this. The Pacific Ocean is just too vast, too dangerous, and all too, presumably, too uncharted to have anything that could remotely understand prehistoric seas. And yet, the DNA says otherwise. The Amazon-Australia connection is a genetic breadcrumb trail, a whisper from deep time suggesting that someone made the journey over deliberate navigation, or just accidental drift hints that Ice Age people may have been very much more mobile than we now think they were. Mainstream archaeology usually brushes this anomaly aside, claiming it as either some unexplained oddity or one that will invariably be restated with a better explanation. For Hancock and others, it did not appear so. In their opinion, it becomes a clue, not a mistake. If Polynesians could reach Easter Island without modern tools, why couldn't Ice Age navigators have undertaken even longer ones connecting continents in ways we are only beginning to glimpse? Similar to all these cases, genetic patterns elicit similar questions in other parts of the world. Sometimes, isolated communities may have fragments of ancestry that contradict their purported history. It's as if, at some time, there were links of some sort between the family of man across oceans, only to be cut by time, flood, and forgetfulness. After these anomalies assemble into a sufficient number, they would not indeed appear as mistakes, but as evidence for something bigger, a forestalled network of contact and exchange. The implications are huge. If a person in Australia or the Pacific could somehow reach South America thousands of years before Columbus did, one of the most entrenched assumptions in history, that oceans were barriers until very recent times, would be entirely turned inside out. Instead, the oceans might be highways on which the knowledge, genes, and culture traveled across the globe. Meanwhile, the DNA indicates that at least some of humankind's ancestors were not bound by such rigid definitions, but were explorers. Hancock advances the argument. If this DNA evidence is real, it is forcing us to rethink entirely what is meant by impossible. Why should anyone assume that Ice Age people did not create seaworthy vessels from ingenuity or creativity or determination? Why picture people trapped by the horizon when later cultures proved otherwise? Just because the archaeological record does not yell, does not mean nothing happened. The signature of Amazon DNA says it all, that it happened. The implication that once people crossed oceans in deep past times amounts to things left beyond genetic traces, possibly maps. And as Hancock often points out, some of those maps contain details no one ought to have known, unless they came from a civilization or an intelligence far older than we dare admit. But DNA isn't the only forbidden clue. Some of the oldest surviving maps on Earth reveal coastlines and continents in ways that history says should have been impossible. Maps that break time. The year is 1513. An Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiles a world map using sources he claims are far older than his own era. Only a fragment of that map survives today, but what it shows has baffled researchers for decades. South America is outlined with uncanny accuracy. The coast of Africa is recognizable. And then, at the bottom edge of the surviving parchment, lies something that should not exist at all: a continent resembling Antarctica. Why is this so strange? Antarctica was not officially discovered by modern civilization until 1819, 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map. And the Antarctica on his parchment is not covered in ice, as it is today. It is depicted with a detailed ice-free coastline, as though someone had charted it thousands of years earlier, when the continent was still accessible. According to geological data, the last time Antarctica's coasts were ice-free was around 12,000 years ago, exactly when Ice Age seas were rising to swallow entire coastlines. Yet, what would an admiral of the 15th century know about information that might have been considered impossible within his time? Piri Reis himself has left his remark in a marginal note. Disavowing originality in his work, rather, he states that he has compiled it out of 20 charts and Mappae Mundi, referring to ancient documents salvaged from the Library of Alexandria, which is the mythical repository of knowledge from civilizations whose recollections have long since lapsed. If indeed this claim is true, then the Piri Reis map is not only a Renaissance artifact in itself, but it is also a window into knowledge much older than itself, a comprehension that has passed down through centuries of copying and redrawing. Modern technology has made the mystery all the more confusing. In the last century, radar mapping of the subglacial bedrock of Antarctica has revealed coastlines and mountain ranges under the ice, some of which disturbingly coincide with what is portrayed on the Piri Reis map. Skeptics call it a coincidence. Believers declare it proof. Regardless, it raises a very disturbing question. How did cartographers half a millennium ago render coastlines that lie under 2 miles of ice? But Piri Reis is by no means alone. Other ancient charts, such as the Orontius Phineus map of 1531 and the Buachi map of 1737, show Antarctica in ways that do not conform to what the mode of the day would have revealed. Among the features they show are rivers, mountain ranges, and coastlines that are either larger or less ice-covered than those of the present-day continent. In places, the maps are as if drawn from an aerial view, as opposed to a view from the sea by a sailor. It is like they had some kind of global imagery, more like satellite data than actual exploration by hand for cartographers. To such narrations, mainstream historians have recently tried to explain them as mistakes, artistic license, or ideas misinterpreted in other coastlines. but the recurrent pattern keeps repeating. Too many details align with the discoveries of modern times. Too many coincidences pile up until coincidence begins to look like design. If the ancient maps preserve fragments of a lost global survey, then someone, humans or otherwise, had definitely been mapping this Earth long before history says they could. As for Hancock, it carries maps around that would be the smoking gun. Inhabs are not represented by legends or myths open to endless reinterpretation. They are artifacts, inked on parchment, with measures definable to modern data. And in those tests revealing knowing 12,000 years out of place, it violates each and every assumption about when humans first learned to master exploration and geography, as well as advanced measurement methods. The Piri-Reis map shouldn't exist. The Orontius-Phineus chart shouldn't exist. And yet, they do. If we accept them as authentic, then we must accept the possibility of a civilization capable of mapping the globe long before the rise of Egypt, Mesopotamia, or Greece. But these maps hold another riddle. They show not just coastlines, but accuracy and longitude, something our own civilization couldn't solve until centuries later. How did they do it? The longitude problem. Anyone can measure latitude. All you need is the sun's height at noon or the stars at night. Ancient sailors, from the Greeks to the Polynesians, mastered this with nothing more than keen observation and simple instruments. But longitude, the east-west position of a place on the globe, is another matter entirely. To calculate it accurately, you need to know the difference between local time and a reference point somewhere else in the world. That requires an accurate clock, something precise enough to keep time during long sea voyages. And here's the problem. Our own civilization didn't solve the longitude question until the late 17th century. Shipwreck after shipwreck in earlier centuries can be traced to navigators misjudging their east-west position. Without a reliable chronometer, sailors could be hundreds of miles off course. It was such a persistent danger that governments offered massive prizes for anyone who could invent a solution. The British Longitude Act of 1714 promised a fortune to the first person who could reliably determine longitude at sea. It wasn't until John Harrison, a self-taught carpenter and clockmaker, invented his revolutionary marine chronometers in the mid-18th century that the problem was finally conquered. It begs the question, why do some of the oldest maps in existence appear to have longitude figured out, possibly centuries before, or even millennia? The Piri-Reis map displays coastlines that were barely captured in outline. It also shows them drawn with such precision that someone who knew the source material must have also known the east-west positioning. Other maps, like the Orontius-Phineus chart of 1531, also exhibit remarkable alignment with modern data, as if they were being measured with accuracy impossible for their time. This is where the mystery gets deeper. Did ancient mapmakers really know something that we don't? Did they measure longitude long before the advent of mechanical chronometers? If so, how? Hancock and other scholars suggest two possibilities. The first is that an unknown human civilization developed some long-forgotten technology to measure time and distance, perhaps through advanced water clocks, methods based on astronomy, or still undiscovered magnetic techniques. The second is that all these were products of a different type of intelligence entirely capable of viewing Earth from above. So, what does longitude really mean? To plot it accurately, you require a global perspective. That is, the Earth is a sphere. You know how to apply its sections, and you keep the time over these great distances. Mainstream history tells us that this kind of understanding was not acquired until recently. Yet the maps that survive whisper a different story, one in which someone, somewhere, possessed a mastery of geography long before recorded history. They have a great place to debate, as the mapping by trial and error, stored experiences, and perhaps a little chance have put them together. But over time, coincidences add up, where Antarctica, the subglacial coastline of Greenland, and South America appear on maps from various centuries before they became visible to modern methods. How can they appear? Why do they act as if these cartographers had solved longitude long ago, while the rest of the world struggled with it for centuries? If the longitude problem were solved at least a couple of thousand years ago, it begs the question, solved by whom? Was it a seafaring Ice Age culture erased by the floods at the end of the glaciation? An unknown human innovation lost in time, waiting to be rediscovered? Or was it something even stranger? Knowledge handed down by an external intelligence, perhaps one not bound to the surface of the Earth at all. And if these maps are echoes of something far older, then the real question is, what physical traces of that lost world still lie hidden, waiting beneath the waves? Underwater ruins and vanished lands. If ancient maps really are fragments of a forgotten global survey, then surely something more tangible should remain. Stone, structures, or ruins that tell the story of a lost seafaring age. According to Graham Hancock, those traces do exist. The problem is that most of them lie not on land, but beneath the sea. Take the Bimini Road, discovered off the coast of the Bahamas in the 1960s. Divers found a stretch of massive limestone blocks laid out in a pattern that looked like a road, a seawall, or perhaps even a harbor. The formation sits about 20 feet underwater, aligned so neatly that many believe it cannot be natural. Mainstream geologists dismiss it as beach rock fractured and shifted by natural processes. Yet Hancock and other divers insist the blocks show signs of deliberate shaping and placement. The real kicker? Geological studies confirm that the area last stood above sea level more than 10,000 years ago, exactly the era when rising seas were swallowing Ice Age coastlines. On the Piri Reis map, one does not see the Grand Bahama Banks marked as an open ocean, but as a great island marked by what appear to be towering columns. If that map was copied from knowledge thousands of years earlier, then the Bimini Formation might be more than a coincidence. It might instead be the last remnant of a port or outpost now lost under waves. And Bimini is not the only place in the world.
There are a whole range of monuments pretty much side by side, and this, to my eye, looks unmistakably to be the work of human beings, not the random action of the ocean on differential layers of stone.
Just off the coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, lies a huge stepped formation below the waterline. Mainstream scholars believe this has been formed over time by the erosion of natural sandstone into terraces. However, divers pointed out the flat surfaces, right angles, and stair-like cuts that bear resemblance to human engineering. Whether it is a submerged city or an extraordinary natural oddity, the debate continues. But it is thousands of years old, possibly contemporaneous with the rise of the sea during the Ice Age. Other anomalies have surfaced around the globe. Strange stone alignments just off the coast near Dwarka in India, sunken complexes in the Mediterranean, and tales of submerged walls and avenues lingering in the Caribbean. Each by itself might be dismissed as geology, but together they form a pattern that the central tenet of Hancock demands. The most advanced communities of the Ice Age would have lived along coastlines, and those coastlines are now buried beneath the ocean. The author thinks about the end of the Ice Age as more of a catastrophe rather than a lengthy transition. It was a time when tremendous ice sheets melted, raising the level of the sea by 400 feet. Coastal plains vanished. Islands shrunk, harbors drowned. A civilization that relied on the sea would view its more prominent cities within the submerged coastal areas. Survivors thus withdrew inland, abandoning their ports and monuments and knowledge to flooding. Over the years, the descendants forgot everything and maybe preserved only a few fragments in myth and legends. For Hancock, underwater ruins are not random curiosities. They constitute the missing pages of human history that were erased not by time, but by water. And with every discovery, the past keeps getting heavier with the idea that ours is an old story. Skeptics insist that with extraordinary claims come the burden of extraordinary evidence. They take the stance that until some good indicators of human construction, inscriptions, artifacts, or tools are found, then places such as Bimini and the Yonaguni cannot be proposed as evidence. But Hancock reverses that argument. Why expect that fragile artifacts could survive while whole coastlines have been swallowed by the sea? Stone is what survives. And stone, aligned and arranged, what divers keep rediscovering. But the mystery deepens, because some maps show not just coastlines, but Earth as if seen from the sky. Human or alien hands. By this point in Graham Hancock's argument, the evidence has stacked up like puzzle pieces that almost, but not quite, form a picture. DNA anomalies that shouldn't exist. Maps that show ice-free coastlines thousands of years out of time. Underwater ruins that appear where maps suggest lost islands once stood. Each clue might be explained away in isolation. Together, they tell a story that forces one profound question: who was responsible? For Hancock, there are two possible answers. The first is that this was entirely human, a forgotten civilization that rose during the Ice Age, mastered navigation, astronomy, and cartography, and then vanished under the waves when the seas rose. Survivors may have passed fragments of their knowledge to later cultures. That would explain why Egyptians suddenly appear with advanced architecture, why Mesopotamia blooms seemingly out of nowhere, and why myths across the world echo with tales of flood and memory. This scenario offers historical perspectives not as linear advancement from primitive to advanced, but as cycles, the height and collapse of mankind, followed by another rise. If there was an Ice Age civilization, then our present world is not the first to have mapped the globe. It is the latest returning to technologies and ideas long known. What we call innovation might actually be recovery. Strange beyond imagination is the other option. Some of these maps, Hancock states, are drawn as if from an aerial or orbital perspective. The coastlines are not depicted as seen aboard a ship, but viewed from a very high place above the Earth. Bird-eye clarity of rivers, mountain ranges, and even continents' shapes could be imputed to none but a sailor. According to Hancock, the high probability is that the knowledge was not fully human. It could have been advanced by some intelligence coming from outside. Possible extraterrestrial visitors who overflew Earth shared bits of their recording with prehistoric men. The myth comes alive here as gods descend from the sky. Almost every culture has its share of myths of beings who came from above, bringing knowledge of farming, astronomy, or architecture. Such are the tales shared by civilizations separated across thousands of miles from one another. Sumerians from the Maya and even the Egyptians have something in common when they speak of these heavenly beings. Divine teachers that gave mankind the very tools for civilization. Is that imagination, then? Or an altered recollection of real contact with a true intelligence, perhaps extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or something we are still trying to define for ourselves? At best, so-called alien hands are speculation, say the critics. Hancock, however, bases his argument on what can lie outside the realm of possible answers, dodging the questions that evidence compels.
I think the best evidence for it is ancient maps, which show the world as it looked during the last ice age. I first explored this in Fingerprints of the Gods, and I've touched on the mystery again, and I haven't.
If maps show coastlines impossible for their time, and genetic fingerprints suggest journeys across oceans before these accounts came to be recorded, here again, only to neglect non-human influence would be equally blind to acknowledging evidence itself. On an applied level, if an Ice Age civilization developed a clever time for measuring longitude, possibly by astronomical means or magnetism, this could alone explain the maps without the need for aliens. But if the same maps do show subglacial coastlines and an overall perspective, then the technology presumed demands far more than stone tools. Would it be possible for this alone to be human ingenuity? Or are we indeed catching glimpses of something alien? And if myths are memories, what do global flood stories tell us about the moment this world was lost? The flood memory that won't die. Every culture on Earth carries a story of water, from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the jungles of Mesoamerica, from the highlands of India to the islands of the Pacific. Myths echo the same haunting theme, a great flood that swallowed cities, erased empires, and forced survivors to begin again. To the mainstream historian, these are simply tales, legends born from local disasters or symbolic stories of renewal. But to Graham Hancock, these myths are not metaphors, they are memories.
Gilgamesh he realizes his mortality and he's trying to find eternal life, and there's this guy Upnapishtim who he runs into who tells him this story of the gods gifted him with eternal life because he saved all the animals on a boat.
Consider the tale of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. It tells of God warning a man of a flood destined to destroy humanity, instructing him to build a vessel and preserve life. Thousands of miles away, the Hebrew Bible recounts Noah and the Ark, a strikingly similar story. In Hindu tradition, Manu is told by a divine being to build a boat before the waters rise. In Mesoamerican mythology, the gods unleash floods that destroy entire ages of humanity. Even in the Pacific, islanders tell of ancestors who fled rising seas, carrying their knowledge to higher ground. It isn't just their sameness, they also align with geology. Then again, 12,800 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, something began to happen. Water literally began to rise upon this earth, from a worldwide rise of more than 400 feet. Disappearing from the map were vast coastlines, flooded. The rivers were in flood. Millions of other square miles turned to ocean and sank into its depths. Not to its gentle beings would have been this transition. It was an apocalypse over generations. Ports drowned depopulated cities. Survivors watched oceans devour the world they knew. And so, in shock, they mythologized. Now modern science supports the scale of this upheaval. Meltwater pulses have been detected in the geological record. Sudden, rapid rises in sea level as the massive ice sheets collapsed into the oceans. Such events would have spelled disaster for any coastal populace. For Hancock, this is the smoking gun. The myths are not allegories, but eyewitness accounts handed down through story and song. The gods who saved a few survivors, the heroes who built arks, and disaster warnings. These might be cultural memories of people from the Ice Age who were trying to preserve knowledge and survive the destruction of their world. If there was indeed an advanced seafaring civilization on those Ice Age coasts, then the flood myths are its epitaph. They indicate why bits of their knowledge linger, maps copied from older ones, genetic scars across continents, and ruins submerged beneath the waves. Everything else was submerged. The survivors withdrew inland, deprived of technology, clinging only to scattered remnants of knowledge. What we might call the dawn of civilization could well have been a resurrection, an attempt, the second, after the first was wiped off by the flood. The maps, the DNA, the submerged ruins, each piece of evidence challenges the story we were taught. So, do these fragments prove a lost age of exploration? Or do they point to something even stranger, an intelligence beyond humanity? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want to keep uncovering hidden histories with us, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and watch the next chapter waiting for you on screen.